What's up, nerds? I've been seeing a lot about NATO troops being sent to Ukraine. We've already talked in the past about French President Emmanuel Macron's comments about sending French troops to Ukraine, but now we're seeing some comments from Estonia talking about sending troops potentially to help out with logistics duties in the western side of Ukraine. So I want to talk about the possibility of NATO troops being sent to Ukraine, specifically what they would be doing, and I also want to talk about the concern about NATO troops being in Ukraine that I've seen online around these deployments. Specifically, will these troops lead to World War III with Russia? We're going to take a look at the NATO charter to see exactly what NATO is and more specifically what NATO isn't, because I think that there is some kind of misunderstanding on what exactly NATO is and isn't, specifically from some of the audience members watching that have not really paid attention to what NATO is, which is fine. But we're going to get an understanding of that, and we're also going to go back and recontextualize what NATO troops are doing in Ukraine around what the NATO charter says and kind of legally what that would look like. NATO troops in Ukraine may be impactful, but not necessarily in the way that you'll think. I'm recording this video on the 15th of May 2024. Now, first, it's important to understand what NATO is and what it isn't. It is a defensive alliance, and you've probably heard that a lot, but you may not necessarily buy it. A lot of the Russian thesis for the justification of the war in Ukraine, especially with regards to NATO, is that NATO has been kind of closing in on Russia, and that it's basically used offense, but veiled itself under the terms of a defensive alliance. There's a lot to unpack with that. That's really something for a whole other video to discuss. But at least for now, looking at the charter, it might sound like hyperbole, but it is in fact not. The whole alliance network is designed to provide insurance for its members, meaning that once one of its members is attacked, it has the insurance to know that other members will come to its aid. This does not carry offensive obligations, and we're going to talk about what exactly that means more specifically here in just a moment. Reading Article 5, this is probably the most frequently cited article in the entire NATO Charter. We're also going to read Article 6 after this because I think that kind of gives more context to Article 5. But let's just read Article 5 together here real quick, and then we will jump into Article 6 and then kind of break that down. Article 5 states, the parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against all of them, and consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense recognized by Article 51 of the Charter of the United Nations, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, gotta love the use of forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force to restore to maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. Any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. Such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. Now, as we just read, and as you probably can tell, that's the article of collective defense, meaning an attack on one is an attack on all. Now, Article 6 provides a little bit more information on that. Quote, for the purpose of Article 5, an armed attack on one or more of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack, either on the territory of any of the parties in Europe or North America, on the Algerian departments of France, on the territory of Turkey, or on the islands under jurisdiction of any of the parties in the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer, or on the forces, vessels, or aircraft of any of the parties when in or over these territories or any other area in Europe in which occupation forces of any of the parties were stationed on the date when the treaty entered into force, or the Mediterranean Sea, or the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. Now, that last little bit is important because this basically provides a geographic constraint to where this treaty actually is enforced. Now, let's say that this does potentially include coverage for NATO forces outside of NATO territory, like say in Algeria or in any other countries in Europe or the Mediterranean where the occupation forces are NATO, but that was as of the time that this treaty entered into force, which was back in the late 1940s or early 1950s. So clearly, because Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, Ukraine is out of scope. It does not count here. Now, having looked at these articles, let's have some quick examples here. Let's look at a quick example. Let's say Finland, which is now, of course, a NATO member, gets attacked by Russia again. I say again, last time was World War II. Let's say Russia wants to go lose another 1 million soldiers, so they attack Finland. Finland, of course, can invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, and it will have other NATO members come to its defense. This probably would not lead to a NATO dogpile on Russia. It would likely look more like, a NATO task force that would be deployed to Finland to blunt the Russian attack and prevent Russia from continuing its offensive. However, it would also likely include a response to try to end the war in Finland and to prevent a larger kind of outbreak of conflict, specifically a nuclear war. That is to say, it probably wouldn't lead to a World War III, at least initially. A NATO task force would be there to defend Finland, prevent the war from continuing, but it wouldn't be there to invade Russia and to destroy Russia as a country. Now, let's say Finland gets the case of the Putins and decides it really, really wants St. Petersburg, and so it launches its own special military operation to take over St. Petersburg. Now, because this is offensive in nature and this is outside the bounds of the NATO Charter, they cannot invoke Article 5 even if Russia retaliates and some cities in Finland start to get bombed. However, that said, they may have their own bilateral agreements, that is, agreements outside of NATO with individual countries that might protect them a bit further. That, like, say, Sweden really supports Finland's idea of denazifying St. Petersburg, and so if Russia retaliates on Finland, maybe they have an agreement with Sweden for Sweden to get involved. But again, this is their own agreements. This is outside of the NATO Charter. Now, of course, this scenario is a little fanciful, so let's look at something maybe a little bit more realistic. Let's say Poland were attacked by Belarus. Like we've said with the example with Finland, they're under attack. You've probably guessed it, they can use Article 5. Now, let's say, however, Poland sends troops into Ukraine. Now, this is something that has been discussed a little bit in the past. Let's say that these troops are not involved in combat roles, but instead they are involved in logistics efforts and in border security, really in an effort to free up the Ukrainian troops that are doing those roles so those troops can go and fight in the east. Now, imagine, of course, Russia's still trying to target Ukrainian logistics, and so they target a rail hub in Lviv that is being operated by the Polish military. And in that strike, several Polish troops die. Again, Poland cannot invoke Article 5 because this is an expeditionary deployment outside the scope of NATO. And while they may be able to rely on bilateral agreements with other countries that might support their sending troops to Ukraine, like, let's say, France, This is not part of the NATO Charter, and this is not something that they can just go to the NATO Security Council and get the whole alliance involved in. Now, this takes us to where NATO troops are most likely to end up in Ukraine, and not necessarily representing NATO, but representing their countries which happen to be in NATO, even though their deployment is not necessarily a NATO deployment. I've talked about this with the French, and it probably would be the same thing with some of these other countries, where this deployment would be west of the Dnieper River, conducting just general security operations like border security, area security, as well as logistics support. And that would free up the Ukrainian troops that are currently doing those jobs to go to the eastern side of the country and fight in the war. Now, Ukraine really needs it. Ukraine really needs as many troops as it can get on the front lines and in reserve. There have been, with the Russian attack in Kharkiv, there's been a recent statement by General Budanov stating that the Ukrainian reserves in eastern Ukraine are basically depleted. They're either in Chasiv Yar or they're in the north in Kharkiv, fending off that attack. Now, that poses a significant strategic dilemma for Ukraine because it really limits what they can and cannot react to. And if Russia were to achieve a breakthrough like down in the south towards Avdiivka, that could pose some significant problems for Ukraine because if they don't have the reserves right now to respond to that, then that's going to be a problem. NATO troops freeing up Ukrainian troops in the west would help reconstitute some semblance of a reserve. However, again, that's really just kind of a band-aid solution to something that Ukraine really needs long-term solutions for. It's already passed its mobilization bill, but it needs those troops to complete their training, to be sent to the front, put into reserve brigades, and things like that. But it also needs to start spinning up probably the next round of mobilization just to make sure that they're going to have enough personnel for the long haul. Now, of course, these NATO troops, and I'm going to call them NATO troops just for the sake of brevity here, these non-Ukrainian European troops in Ukraine, the risk of these is really whenever Russia strikes and one of these troops gets killed, or several of these troops get killed. There's also the risk of Russia just deliberately targeting military facilities outside of Ukraine, like in, say, Poland, in this example, that are supporting those troops or are supporting the war effort, like a rail hub in, somewhere in Poland. That could be a problem. From there, things get a little fuzzy because that I understand that is something that, Poland can go and invoke Article 5 for, even though, the Russian strike is really in response to an expeditionary Polish, deployment. That doesn't necessarily mean that Russia should just automatically start targeting Poland themselves. So there is some escalation management on the Russian side, actually, to this whole conflict. If Polish troops start, going into Western Ukraine, those troops may be, basically free to fire at. However, if Russia were to just launch a missile on the Polish side of the border, that would probably lead to a larger escalation. And so for Russia, that's probably something that they're going to have to manage on their end. Now, like I've mentioned a little bit, NATO troops would be impactful in this war because it would free up those Ukrainian troops to fight. The reconstitution of the reserves is incredibly important. I've already stated that poses a strategic dilemma for Ukraine if they're not able to get some sort of reserve reconstituted as soon as possible. It'd be a nice quick fix to their manpower problems, but like I've already said, they've got to get the mobilization spooled up and get more folks in uniform. But having said all of this, we're probably not likely to see any of this anytime soon. The risks of escalation with any kind of deployment like this are pretty significant. Russia has stated that it would consider military assets outside of Ukraine as military or as valid targets. And I think that is actually something that they have had yet to back up because, NATO and, NATO countries, NATO member countries have been supporting Ukraine for basically since the start of the war, and Russia has yet to target any of those kinds of facilities. And they probably wouldn't risk that even if NATO troops were actually physically in Western Ukraine, because again, that's still NATO. Yes, Russia has nukes, but so does the US, UK, and France. So it's not like, Russia can just they can sling these nuclear threats around because they know that frightens the American people, but they also realize that they have nukes pointed at them too. And believe it or not, Russians don't like getting nuked. If you're Russian and in the comments, definitely let me know if you like getting nuked or if you don't, because my guess is you don't. And so the Western audience watching this, at least know that, we all have something in common with the Russians. We all don't want to get nuked. So that we can have those warm fuzzies together. Now, the longer it takes some of these, NATO member troops to get into Western Ukraine, then the longer it'll take for the Ukrainian manpower problem to even have a Band-Aid solution applied. And the less that it'll help their present reserve problem. By the time that NATO troops more realistically get there, even if that's a year down the road from now, 2 years, or even never, that's not going to help Ukraine right now. Even then, it's just a temporary fix. And in either case, Ukraine's going to have to resolve this problem on their own somehow. Now, with all that, I want to hear all of your thoughts about this. There's a lot to discuss on this. If you have a different interpretation of the NATO Charter, definitely let me know down in the video comments. And, will this lead to World War III? And why do you think that is? So with all that, like this video if you found it helpful or informative, and subscribe for more analysis on the war in Ukraine and other conflicts as they pop up. With all that, I'll see y'all later. Bye.